Alright, I'm gonna need some audience participation on this one. Let me know in the comments if you were surprised seeing this in your sub box or even in your recommended or whatever, not because it exists, but because you thought I made this video already. Because this, even to me, seems like the topic I would have done something on years ago, but no, I've alluded to it, I've referenced the fact that this is something worth thinking about in the past, many times, but this is the first time I have given this a dedicated video, and it's really funny. I think the craziest thing is that this is a video that I'm effectively making in the middle of a content drought for the series. Yeah, the physical Switch 2 version of XDE is out now, but there's not even a day one update fixing any of the myriad issues with it, so I have nothing to say about that I haven't said already. So you'd think that I'd be left scraping the dirt under the bottom of the barrel looking for worms who have good ideas for Xenoblade videos, but no, we're just doing this now apparently. Anyway, it's a Nopon video talking about Nopon conspiracy theories and Nopon conspiracy theories. That involves talking about every Xenoblade game, so spoilers for all of those. So yes, the Nopon situation is crazy, and it's honestly been kind of crazy since 2017, so we've got a lot to dig into. Ironically enough, the first thing we need to talk about is why it hasn't been crazy since 2015, which is when the original Xenoblade X, the second game Nopon showed up in, first came out. Well, that's because it wasn't weird for Nopon to show up in that game. Firstly, it made sense that there were Nopon in Xenoblade 1, as there was some kind of fluffy mascot character in Xenogears and Xenosaga, and even Baten Kaitos to an extent has something like that. So even though Xenoblade 1 might not have originally been intended as a Xeno game, and even though it is extremely likely the Nopon race and probably Riki as a party member predated the name Xenoblade being applied to that game mid-development, it was still an understandable, fitting thing for those guys to happen, and nothing in the story makes it unusual. As for X, Nopon also being in that game didn't raise a lot of suspicion for two different reasons. The first reason is that X is another game in the Xenoblade series. Think about it. The only reason Choo-Choos aren't in Xenosaga and Bunny isn't in Xenoblade is because they're different games in different IPs. If you're making another game in the same IP, there's no need to change the mascot character, so as long as you want to have one, and it's clearly been shown throughout the series' history that Xeno likes having mascot characters, why would you change it from something other than what the previous game using the same IP had? The second thing is that Xenoblade X's connection to Xenoblade 1 back in the day was an extremely binary thing. Either it wasn't connected at all, or it was a direct sequel to the original game. In the case it wasn't connected at all, it was literally just the same Final Fantasy situation. Different games using the same series name, similar elements and themes, but being completely unconnected universes. As such, that would make Nopon/Nopon the Moogles, so they're gonna be in every game without any explanation for why they need to be there, because they're just an intrinsic part of the series. And yes, going forward through the rest of the games, that is the real reason Nopon are there. They're a fundamental characteristic of what makes Xenoblade Xenoblade, but we're talking more meta and in-universe level. The only other option people considered was that X is a direct sequel to Xenoblade 1. Mira is what eventually became of the world Shulk created at the end of that game, and as such, there were Nopon in that world, so eventually there being Nopon on Mira does just make sense, and also explain certain other things like geographical similarities, other callbacks to Xenoblade 1, especially in Tatsu's dialogue, and stuff like the Telethia. Xenoblade 2 was the real first time this was a discussion worth having, and funnily enough, it wasn't one that people really considered until after the game came out. And that's because, while yes, there was the theory about X connecting to 1, pre-release material of 2 very heavily indicated that it was just going to be a Final Fantasy-style sequel to the original Xenoblade. While yeah, some people who didn't believe X was a direct sequel to 1 did think 2 might be, for the most part, people seems to agree that, yup, they called it 2 because X didn't sell or review as well as 1 did, so they're kind of just shoving it under the rug because it's on the Wii U and nobody cares about that now that the Switch is out and has already outsold it by the time I finish the sentence, and because it has a much more similar structure and gameplay loop to the original game. So paradoxically, calling it 2 actually made more sense from a marketing perspective, even if it wasn't directly connected to 1. And then Xenoblade 2 came out, and we beat Xenoblade 2. And we learned the truth about how it connects to Xenoblade 1. Yes, it did introduce the multiverse, which brought in another theory about how X connected to 1, that did end up eventually getting proven true by DE, but we are not there yet. And the most intriguing part at the time was actually Nopon being in Allrest, and not Mira. And that's because, in Xenoblade 1, Nopon were full stop created by Zanza. He had a much more hands-on role in creating life on Bionis than Klaus did in Allrest, and as far as we know, he did in fact create Nopon. On the Xenoblade 2 side, yeah, Klaus is the other half of Zanza. If Klaus was as hands-on as Zanza was, it would make sense that they would create the same things. That's not what happened. Klaus basically just kickstarted life starting again. As far as we know, he just manipulated the Cloud Sea nanomachines to start repairing the world below, and then dropped core crystals down, causing them to eventually seed that Cloud Sea with life, which led to the Allrest we see in Xenoblade 2 through evolution, not direct creation. And then things get even weirder when you see the Tree of Life during Klaus's speech to the party in Chapter 10, and Nopon are fairly conspicuously not on it. To be fair, the succession depicted on the tree also doesn't make sense for actual evolution either, and Blades and Titans appear separately, which should not be the case, they are different life stages of the same organism, but every sentient and almost every major monster species is present on there except Nopon. And then there's also the side quest where it's revealed that Nopon's speech was basically a grift started by the legendary pirate Captain Nopopon, who also founded the Argentum Trade Guild, used to make them seem more cute and unassuming so that it would advance their diplomacy and cause more people to buy from them. According to the quest, Nopopon's old logbook was written in sophisticated human dialect and not the original Nopon tongue, and he created the Nopon way of speech in Allrest. This is interesting because fast forward to Xenoblade 3, and while it seems like in both worlds Nopon speaking the way they do was very well established long before this, Nopon basically ran this exact same grift against Mobius. They made their own pact and were able to still survive while being merchants, while also being able to continue existing as immortal beings who remember the truth of the worlds, and embed themselves in Keves, Agnes, and the city, and therefore on the down low continue furthering the Queen's plans for liberating Ionios from Mobius, eventually resulting in Riku becoming the 7th founder and everything about Lucky 7 and Ouroboros. Now, I'm going to ignore Xenoblade 3 for the rest of this video, because Nopon existed in Xenoblade 1 and Xenoblade 2's worlds, which combined to form 3. There's nothing weird or conspiratorial about them existing in that game whatsoever. However, the fact that they did something similar in Xenoblade 3's worlds to how they did in Xenoblade 2 could indicate that, yeah, it could just be some ancestral memory, or a Nopon from Allrest who knew the history of Captain Nopopon suggesting they pull something similar, but it could just be that Nopon are primed to be actors outside the natural order or passage of fate or what have you. And I'm saying this because Nopon seemingly appeared mysteriously in Allrest. But do we actually know for sure they were created by Zanza on Bionis? Well, I don't believe Nopon's speech exists the way it does on Bionis because of similar reasons to Allrest. I think they do just naturally talk like that. We've never actually seen anyone try to use the Monado 1 to hurt a Nopon, so we don't know for sure if they're actually created by Zanza at all. If Nopon exist and show up and are known to be outside the order of things in other places they appear, who's to say their original appearance isn't also something similar? As an aside, a very boring explanation for Nopon existing on Mira is simply some of them fell through a fog rift during Future Connected and ended up there, because that's basically the running theory as to why Telethia the Endbringer exists on Mira. However, Telethia seems to have taken a more roundabout way to get there, as it exists in the ancestral memory of the Orphean Ova, which implies that at some point in between Bionis Shoulder and Mira, it ended up on their home planet, which was in a completely different universe. So Telethia's stuff would have to be something completely different multiverse-wise, and as far as we know, there is only one type of fog rift, which I don't even know how Telethia got outside of the Xenoblade 1, Xenoblade 2 split worlds thing in the first place, because those rifts were caused by the impending intersection, which resulted in Xenoblade 3 happening, so I don't know what was going on there. I think it's very impressive that Telethia managed to get out of the two connected worlds without the conduit helping, and just a regular rift from that happening, but that is very beside the point. Either way, while it does seem like they're somehow genetically predisposed to be in the right place at the right time, it doesn't seem like there's any big conspiracy behind Nopon society to go and do all the stuff they've been doing across the different games, And that's just because, well, they have their own functional technology and are able to fight in ways no one else on Bionis can. Frontier Village doesn't seem to be a particularly advanced culture in terms of being able to do stuff like that or influence things in any real way, and the Nopon elsewhere in the Homs colonies or even in Alchemoth are relatively assimilated into those societies, and don't seem like they're able to do anything above and beyond what just a normal contributing member of those societies would be. There was a conspiracy behind part of Alrest's Nopon society, but that didn't particularly seem to be inclined to help people out or push the world in a better direction. It existed to further the Nopon's position in that world. And besides, this is something that was ancient history during the Aegis War, so especially by the time of the main game, the closest thing to any grand conspiracy to save Alrest anyone is operating on is honestly Banna, because he is continuing on the founder of Argentum's original plans of just making a lot of money, which doesn't seem to be anything similar to what Rico and friends got up to in Ionios. So it does seem that, although Nopon are a multiversal race, there isn't a concrete plan behind them existing in multiple universes, at least on the part of the Nopon themselves, because while they all share a lot of similarities, each iteration of them is different and is doing different things, and only in Xenoblade 3, where two different iterations of Nopon are combined, do they have an active conspiracy going on in the background. Now, that's the thing. Oh, Nopon are a multiversal race. So are humans in the Xeno series. Is it really a big deal that they appear in multiple universes in the first place? Well, yes and no. As long as you're willing to accept the idea that an Earth with a humanity living on it can exist in multiple universes within the Xeno multiverse, which is honestly something that's taken as a given more often than not in any sort of media that has a multiverse, and I really think the idea of that not being true, as in there is only one Earth that exists as we know it in the multiverse, is something that should be explored elsewhere. It's not really a surprise that humans show up in every Xenoblade game. In Xenoblade 1, Homs were created by Zanza. Zanza was a human from Earth. It makes sense that he would create something similar to what he knows, and even High Endia, whose true form are Telethia, when given a sentient form, they're basically just bird elves. In Xenoblade X, the humans are literally humans from Earth, albeit in the bodies of Mimiosomes. And in Xenoblade 2, well, this is the one that's the most contentious, because here is the one case you could reasonably make for there being a cosmic coincidence behind there being a humanity. Nopon not existing on the evolution tree is one thing, but how did humans evolve more or less the way they were back on Earth? The answer to that is very simple. Core crystals were the basis of all life in Alrest, and core crystals were originally supposed to be biotech to help out humans, so it does make some sense that the life that spawned from Titans that grew from those core crystals would eventually evolve into something that looks very similar to humans from old Earth. You'd think then that Nopon are this weird edge case that's the only thing that exists in all three settings, but that's not entirely true. Barring the Telethia, X doesn't have any enemies in common with the other games, though many of its species are analogous to ones from Xenoblade 1. That is not the case for all of the other games. The majority of Xenoblade 1's enemy species also do show up in 2, with some like Gogol's and Ferris getting redesigned, but others just basically being the same with some color palette tweaks. And this includes other sentient races as well. Turken and Ignis are capable of using chain attacks in Xenoblade 1, clearly have structured societies and use tools, as evidenced by a lot of the ways they're just placed out in the world and many of their drops from Xenoblade 1. And from 2 onwards, at the very least, Turken are clearly capable of speech and communicating with the other races. This means Nopon showing up in both 1 and 2 isn't out of the ordinary, so the only thing that makes them unique is the fact that Nopon can also be found on Mira, and one other thing that I will be getting to later. So then, can I justify all of the overlap between species in Xenoblade 1 and 2 without just pulling the out-of-universe, asset reuse, and numbered Xenoblades wanting to be more similar to each other than X excuses, which are the real reasons, just not as far as we're concerned here? Well, the rift in Klaus's body does allow at least some form of communication across the worlds, as Architect Klaus is aware of things going on in Xenoblade 1, and seems to have enough grasp of what's going on to accurately predict that Zanza is not going to win the final battle before it even starts. Him just being able to see through Zanza's eyes does make sense, and I'm more than willing to buy that he can do it that way, but Zanza can't do the opposite just because of their different outlooks and the fact that Klaus has all of his memories and can use the beanstalk properly with 2 other Trinity cores. But this goes beyond that. I'm almost inclined to believe that Alvis periodically relayed information to Klaus, and he was just light on the details when talking to the Xenoblade 2 party because the only thing relevant to their situation at the time was the fact that Ontos was somewhere else. So we've got at least some information exchange across both worlds, and tons of core crystals on the Xenoblade 2 side sending information back to the Trinity processor. Zanza and Mainet's powers both come from Ontos, so is it possible that they were subconsciously influenced by some information that Ontos received from core crystals in Allrest, and that is what led Zanza to recreate similar species? I guess, maybe. Is it possible that Ontos observed Zanza's creations, and that somehow got communicated back to regular core crystals in Allrest, which eventually caused them to spawn life similar to that Zanza created? The issue is that despite knowing the final battles of 1 and 2 take place at the same time, for the rest of the history of both worlds, we don't know which happened before what. So we don't even know which of the 2 was the first to develop life. I've never raised the possibility before, but there is also absolutely a chance that Klaus had a much more hands-on role in the development of life in Allrest than we've been thinking the entire time. Did he just send down the first wave of core crystals and observe everything? Or did he do it in waves, gradually allowing life to evolve probably much faster than it did for the first time on Old Earth, and maybe making tweaks to the core crystal, changing the DNA, nudging things in the direction to make sure life would develop, and that kind of thing? If that was the case, then it's way easier. Klaus and Zanza are 2 halves of the same person, they would have similar ideas for developing ecosystems, and it would just be as simple as that. I don't really know the answer here. Honestly, it's probably some combination of all of these factors, and there's also the fact that we just don't remotely explore the entire world in either 1 and 2. In one's case, there's 2 entire Bionis limbs we never touch. There were at least 7 other Homs colonies that were destroyed in the past. Some of them existed within living memory, and we don't know where any of the ruins are. And in 2, there are several named major titans we never see, plus like almost a dozen other Nopon trade guilds. And the titans are dying out. There were likely major titans prior to even Torna that just got completely off-screened and we never even heard about. You want to know where Plambuses and Squoods were in Xenoblade 1 and where Chromars and Hodes were in 2? Those territories the parties never explored were probably the answer. I'm beginning to think that if anything is a cosmic fate-dictated thing, it is the fact that these species are all mirrored across Xenoblade 1 and 2, because it's like poetry, it rhymes, it makes sense for the 2 halves of the split world to evolve independently, but in a very parallel fashion. This then means we need to look into Nopon's role in society, as well as Xenoblade X specifically, to try and see if there is anything special about exclusively Nopon. Ignoring the drastically different number of titans involved in both worlds, realistically the thing that most sets the worlds of 1 and 2 apart are the different sentient races between them, and the way society has developed, because that is the one thing that is almost entirely different, especially owing to the existence of blades in Allrest, when they do not exist at all in Xenoblade 1. That being said, the way Nopon fit into society is virtually identical between the 2 games. You may not think this is true, but your perception is heavily skewed by the Nopon party members we get in both games. Nopon merchants exist in Xenoblade 1. Now, I don't just mean Nopon who are merchants, I mean an organization of Nopon merchants. According to the side quest Proof of Status, Bionis' version of Nopon coins are not currency in and of themselves. They are, well, proof of status, identifying the owner as a licensed Nopon merchant. From everything we can see with NPCs, the Nopon merchant role is an important part of Nopon culture on Bionis, it's just not emphasized because it's not relevant to what we see. 4 of the 7 party members are from Colony 9, which is a primarily Homs colony, so the vast majority of Nopon that live there have just assimilated into Homs culture and society. Then Ricky is not a Nopon merchant, he is from Frontier Village, the ancestral Nopon home, so you're not going to hear a lot about traveling merchants from Ricky, who has lived in a place inhabited by only Nopon his entire life. And on top of that, some of Shulk's colleagues at the Weapon Development Lab are also Nopon. So, Engineer Nopon have been a thing since Xenoblade 1 as well. This is just all not emphasized because Ricky comes from a pastoral village that's probably sustained by money from the Nopon merchants who don't live there, and most of the Nopon Shulk would have known growing up would have just been permanent residents of Colony 9. On Xenoblade 2's side, Rex doesn't live in his hometown anymore, and very few Nopon call Fonset home at all, but his primary employer is one of the Nopon trade guilds, so we're a lot more exposed to that up front, though this is the first case of Nopon traders employing non-Nopon. It never seemed to be the case in Xenoblade 1, and in X, well, prior to everyone landing on Mira, the Nopon trade caravans could only really trade with each other and L, so they didn't exactly have other people to employ at all. In contrast to Ricky, Tora lives in a major city where Nopon are a minority in the population, and he's originally from More Ardain, an even more built-up area, ruled and primarily inhabited by a race that just looks like humans. He and his family are also all engineers, which puts the background for the primary Nopon POV for the game much closer to Mephi than any story-relevant Nopon from 1. Unfortunately, there is basically nothing to talk about from X that hasn't already been said. All Nopon except the ones that move to NLA are nomadic and they live in caravans. Many of them are merchants, and I assume the ones who are not merchants just do hunting and gathering, and also manufacturing their own goods, because the caravans could not continue to exist if that wasn't the case. Yeah. So across 3 different worlds, Nopon culture is inclined to put a lot of emphasis on merchants. And that's interesting and all, but also, apparently Nopon have had secret mysterious powers and been able to live forever long before Ionios even happened. Yeah, I'm talking about the Nopon sages. Just talking about the regular sages here for the time being. As far as living forever goes, the Xenoblade 1 original Nopon sage and the 4 divine Nopon in X are all listed as 9999 years old on the affinity chart, and the Nopon sage from 2 who appears in Dahlia's quest is at least 500. This is because the Nopon half-sage who appears in Torna the Golden Country, related to the super bosses from that game, is a shrunken down version of that Nopon sage model, and not the Archsage as he appears in 2, which is something a lot of people, including myself in the past, have gotten wrong. One sage was just an incredibly powerful warrior and the first true hero pawn, of which Ricky becomes the second. And the sage in 2 is just kind of an asshole, honestly. Yeah, he gives you the locations of the super bosses in Torna, but he charges you large amounts and just kind of complains about everything. He's also described as an avatar of greed, and then later on when you encounter him in Tantal for Dahlia's quest, he refuses to give you the location of a child who's missing in the snow until you either threaten him or get him food in the form of equivalent items to the offerings to the sage in Xenoblade 1. On Mira, there's an entire quest about a Nopon seeing a mysterious spirit that leads you to encounter Napopon, Napopon, Nippopon, and Nupopon, a group of 4 9999-year-old divine Nopon spirits who the affinity chart all describes as, "This spirit is a legend among Nopon, though its true identity remains a mystery." The ironic thing about this quest is that Napopon sends you to the other 3 spirits specifically so that you can polish a gemstone that will allegedly reveal secrets of how the Nopon came to Mira in the first place. So if the end of this quest wasn't a gag, we would have actually had the answer. Though from Napopon claiming he doesn't even know how the Nopon came to Mira, we can at least infer they've been there for substantially longer than 10,000 years. Based on this information, we can guess that the legend around Napopon isn't true, but it does state that he is a guardian deity who appears wherever Nopon make their home, and that because he's appeared on Mira now, that means it is a true Nopon home. So apparently, in lore of Mira Nopon, Mira was not their original home, which might just still be the case because the story of Xenoblade 1 exists as a legend, and they still know about things like Hom-Homs in Frontier Village. Did some Nopon from Biona's shoulder actually follow Telethia through the rifts? Some of them stopping off at the Orphean home planet and maybe evolving into bugs, and then the rest becoming Nopon on Mira? I don't know, but really the only place we visited where we can actually say Nopon are from here is Frontier Village, and even then, who knows if they were created by Zanza? And then there are the Archsages from the numbered games, who I'm saving for last, firstly because we don't know how canon they are, And secondly, because it's kept, I'm assuming deliberately, ambiguous whether or not the one from each game is the same person or if they're a different guy each time. They're all Nopon who seemingly exist outside the normal flow of space and time and have many powers, such as being able to reconstruct memories, provide restrictions on party members, and give them rewards that don't exist from their original worlds. The one from Xenoblade 2 is even able to connect other worlds to Aurest, pulling Shulk and Fiora from Bionis, and Elma from Mira. He can seemingly even manifest or has allies on Mira, as a Nopon merchant gave Elma a training pod, which is what brought her to the Land of Challenge. If the Archsages are canon, this would indicate that Nopon are actually an extremely powerful, multiversal civilization that exists outside of space-time, and all the ones we've seen living normally across all the settings are descendants of those who chose to give up that life and settle down in a specific world they'd come to love, gradually forgetting about their true history and true powers. This would then make all of the regular sages that we know are canon make a bit more sense, as their powers and longevity would just be something any Nopon could access, they just have lost the way to do so. Maybe the 4 divine spirits are actually this archsage kind of Nopon, and they do go around to different worlds Nopon live in acting as guardian deities, and they just happen to not know how they got to Mira. The only problem is that we have no idea whether or not the Land of Challenge is canon, though I think I'm willing to believe that they've become progressively more canon as time goes on, as the Shulk and Fiora that show up in Xenoblade 2 don't really work for any point in time during or after the Xenoblade 1 story. Then in Xenoblade 1 DE, the Land of Challenge just kind of exists and no one really acknowledges it, while in 3, there's no canon-breaking thing from any game because there's no crossover element to it, but there are still actual cutscenes of interacting with the Archsage, so you could somewhat reasonably argue that that scene should be given the same weight as any actual story or hero quest scene. I don't really know what to make about that, but I would like to conclude with the 2 theories I think are most likely to be true about what Nopon are. The first is just that Nopon are Nopon. They keep showing up because they are the mascot race for the Xenoblade series and people tend to like them. And they keep having weird mysterious powers all the time and referencing things they shouldn't know because it's a running gag and it's funny. The second is that the true origin of Nopon lies within the upper domain, and all those we see are merely Nopon either lowering themselves to interact with the lower domain, or the descendants of those that voluntarily chose to live there, similar to the Archsage thing. Why are Nopon mostly the same no matter where you go? Well, that's just because all Nopon in the multiverse have the same ultimate origin, and as dumb as even saying this as a theory is, there's not really anything to dispute it. It does arguably make the entire Xenoblade 2 evolution tree thing make sense, because the conduit's there, that's a connection to the upper domain, and then Nopon show up with no known origin and all rest, that almost actually makes sense. People like Shulk and Rex age in Ionios, but the Nopon are functionally immortal, seemingly having the same level of admin hacks privileges that the queens do. What if this isn't because of origin, but because origin activating and recreating the Nopon just gave them some of their old powers back? The 1,000 years Riku lived between Future Redeemed and the main game is only a fraction of the time even a regular Nopon sage has been shown to live for, and Riku doesn't even have any powers beyond that. He can barely fight even with another Nopon, and it seems like all his skill points were spec'd into smarts and being a Satan reference. So the majority of Nopon from Aurest and Bionis, who knew nothing of their phenomenal cosmic power, only passively gaining the immortality as a result of their minds and bodies being reconstructed by the Origin Project, is weirdly easier to believe than it probably should be. Do I think they're going to retroactively turn Udu into a Nopon or something? No, of course not. If Nopon have a secret origin that isn't just the developers keep wanting to make them, it's probably not even going to be used as a plot point. It's much more likely to just be a throwaway thing as a joke or as an aside, rather than something anything important actually hinges on. That being said, Monolith Soft's corporate mascot is this Nopon named Monopon, who has been brought to the Land of Challenge in Xenoblade 2 to do battle against Tora, and is also sometimes drawn into real-world photos of Monolith's HQ while they talk about their work environment. So in some small way, Nopon have sojourned across the multiverse and even made it to this world, with the one who's been there actually being one who's met an Archsage and fought a Xenoblade party member in the past. I doubt Xenoblade is ever going to get to the meta level where they're going to also include the real world as one of the universes where Earth exists and hasn't yet been destroyed or something. If anything, they're going to make the real world the actual upper domain, which I don't know what that says about Nopon existing if Nopon are also upper domain existences. Maybe merely the idea that humans created them makes them existences of that or something. Anyway though, they're not going to get meta and actually do something about Monopon quote-unquote existing in the real world and then also appearing in the games. I am almost certain she's going to make another cameo, but they could do something about the multiversal existence of Nopon as a society, and I think they might, even if it is only as a joke. Basically, I think all the funniness around Nopon is not that deep right now, but if they want to make it something, they could make it something. And if they do make it something, I don't really know how serious they're going to be about it. Probably took way too long to say that, but that is my conclusion. And until next time, this is Luxon, signing off.